Kira Thainvel adjusted her formal ceremonial robes for the third time in 10 minutes and tried to convince herself that the sick feeling in her stomach was anticipation rather than dread. The diplomatic station Concordia's ceremonial bonding chamber was decorated in what the event coordinators optimistically called interspecies harmony style, which meant it looked like a rainbow had exploded in a furniture store. She stood at the designated position for unmarried female presenting for courtship consideration, a phrase that made her feel like livestock at auction. Remember, her mother's voice echoed through her communication implant, smile demurely, speak only when directly addressed, and for the love of our ancestors, do not mention your opinions about military strategy. What if he asks about military strategy? Kira muttered under her breath. Then you smile and say, I defer to your superior knowledge on such matters, came the crisp reply. The Altarian delegation specifically requested a wife who would provide intellectual companionship without being argumentative. Kira's pointed ears twitched with irritation. How exactly does one provide intellectual companionship without having opinions? Kira. The warning tone in her mother's voice was clear even through the communication device. This was her third arranged courtship meeting this month, and the Vailian Council was running out of patience with her apparent inability to secure an appropriate marriage alliance. As the last unmarried female of the noble Thainvel bloodline, her continued single status was becoming what the council delicately termed a diplomatic concern. The chamber doors opened with ceremonial chimes that sounded like someone had taught wind chimes to be pretentious, and Kira arranged her face into what she hoped looked like demure anticipation rather than desperate resignation. Commander Veltar of the Altarian Strategic Fleet entered with the kind of posture that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with military precision and tactical superiority. He was precisely what the marriage brokers had promised, distinguished, accomplished, politically valuable, and completely uninterested in Kira as anything other than a convenient alliance-building tool. Lady Thainvel, he said, executing a perfect formal bow. Your reputation for beauty and grace precedes you. Thank you, Commander, Kira replied, wondering if he'd actually researched anything about her beyond her bloodline and marriageability status. I'm honored by your interest in our family's alliance potential. They settled into the formal courtship seating arrangement, carefully positioned chairs that allowed for conversation while maintaining appropriate distance and dignity. Kira had performed this ritual so many times she could probably do it in her sleep, which was fortunate because her mind was already starting to wander. I trust you've been briefed on the strategic importance of Altarian-Vailian cooperation in the current political climate, Veltar began, consulting a small tablet that probably contained talking points about her family's trade connections and diplomatic influence. Certainly, Kira said, her diplomatic training taking over. The eastern trade routes have become increasingly vital since the Centauri blockades, and Altarian military support would significantly strengthen Vailian shipping security. Veltar looked pleased. Precisely. A wife who understands the broader political implications would be invaluable for maintaining appropriate social connections. And what about the defensive implications of joint patrol strategies? Kira asked, genuinely interested despite herself. I've been reading about Altarian fleet tactics, and it seems like coordinated defense grids could. I beg your pardon. Veltar's expression shifted from pleased to confused. The defense grids, Kira repeated, warming to the topic. Your triformation patrol patterns are fascinating, but I wonder if they've been adapted for the asteroid field configurations in Vailian space. The navigational challenges would require significant tactical modifications. Veltar set down his tablet and looked at her with the expression of someone who just realized they were having an entirely different conversation than expected. Lady Thainvel, while I appreciate your interest in military affairs, I should clarify that I'm seeking a companion for social functions and domestic management, not a strategic advisor. Of course, Kira said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice. Though surely domestic management involves some strategic thinking. Resource allocation, efficiency optimization, long-term planning. I think, Veltar said carefully, there may be some cultural miscommunication here. When I speak of domestic management, I mean supervision of household staff, organization of social events, and the traditional feminine arts of hospitality and grace. Kira felt her diplomatic smile growing more strained. And what would I do with the rest of my time? The rest of your time? Well, yes. Household supervision and social events presumably don't require 18 hours a day. What would occupy my intellectual attention during the remaining time? Veltar looked genuinely puzzled. I suppose, whatever interests are appropriate for a married woman of your station. Artistic pursuits. Cultural patronage. What about research? Or consulting work? I have some theories about trade route optimization that could benefit both our species. The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either revelations or disasters. Veltar studied her with the expression of someone reassessing a tactical situation that had developed in unexpected directions. Lady Thanevel, he said finally, I fear there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of the partnership I'm seeking. I require a wife who will enhance my social standing and provide appropriate domestic stability. I'm not looking for a business partner. I see, Kira said, though she was beginning to see more clearly than she'd expected. And if I were to have opinions about your military strategies? Or suggestions for improving trade agreements? Or ideas about diplomatic innovations? I would expect, Veltar said with growing firmness, that you would discuss such thoughts with me privately, if at all, and defer to my judgment in all matters of public importance. Kira felt something crystallize in her mind. Not quite anger, but a clear recognition of exactly what this partnership would actually entail. So my role would be to appear intelligent enough to be interesting, but never intelligent enough to be challenging? That's a crude way to phrase it, but essentially accurate. And you see this as an appealing arrangement? Veltar's confusion was becoming tinged with irritation. I see this as a traditional marriage arrangement between two noble houses with mutual political benefits. I'm not sure what else you were expecting. Kira stood up, her ceremonial robes rustling with what sounded like barely contained frustration. I was expecting, foolishly perhaps, that marriage might involve some acknowledgement that I'm a person with thoughts and opinions rather than a decorative political asset. Lady Thanevel, I think you may have some unrealistic expectations about. Commander Veltar, Kira interrupted, her diplomatic training finally giving way to honest exasperation. I think you should know that my theories about trade route optimization have already been implemented by 3 different shipping consortiums. My analysis of defensive grid patterns was cited in the last Eltarian Strategic Review, and my suggestions for diplomatic protocol reform were adopted by the Interspecies Alliance Council last year. Veltar stared at her. You, what? I'm not just a noble bloodline looking for an appropriate marriage. I'm a person with ideas, accomplishments, and intellectual interests that extend beyond choosing table linens and organizing dinner parties. But, you're unmarried. Yes, Kira said, her voice gaining strength with each word. Because apparently, having thoughts makes me unsuitable for marriage. Which suggests that the problem isn't with me. It's with a system that treats marriage as a business transaction between families rather than a partnership between individuals. Veltar gathered his materials with the efficient movements of someone executing a strategic withdrawal. I believe, he said stiffly, that we may not be compatible after all. I believe, Kira replied, that's the first thing we've agreed on all evening. After he left, Kira remained in the ceremony chamber, staring at the ridiculous decorations and wondering how many more times she could perform this charade before the Vailian Council decided to arrange a marriage for her regardless of her preferences. Her communication implant chimed with what was undoubtedly her mother calling for a post-courtship report, but Kira ignored it and headed for the observation decks instead. She needed air, space, and possibly a complete reconsideration of what the rest of her life was going to look like. David Chen was 3 levels deep in the environmental control systems when he heard someone talking to themselves in what sounded like frustrated Vailian. He paused in his recalibration of atmospheric processor 7 and listened more carefully, partly out of professional curiosity and partly because anyone wandering around the maintenance levels at 0300 hours was either lost, desperate, or possibly both. Complete waste of time and ceremonial fabric, the voice was saying. Might as well have posted a sign reading "Intelligent woman seeks man who will pretend she's not intelligent." David extracted himself from the processor housing and found a Vailian woman sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the main atmospheric intake, still wearing what looked like formal ceremonial robes that probably cost more than his annual salary. Her pointed ears were drooping in what he'd learned was usually a sign of dejection or exhaustion, and she was addressing her complaints to the air recycling unit as if it might offer useful relationship advice. "Excuse me," David said gently, not wanting to startle her. "Are you lost? The observation decks are 2 levels up, and the diplomatic quarters are in the opposite direction." She looked up at him with the expression of someone who'd been caught doing something mildly embarrassing but was too tired to be properly mortified. "I'm not lost. I'm hiding from my communication implant and the inevitable lecture about how I've once again failed to secure an appropriate marriage alliance." "Ah," David said, as if this were a perfectly normal explanation for finding nobility in his maintenance areas. "Rough evening?" Third potential suitor this month who was looking for what he described as intellectual companionship without argumentative tendencies. She gestured at her elaborate outfit with obvious frustration. "Apparently, expressing interest in military strategy makes me unsuitable for marriage." David considered this while checking his diagnostic tablet. "That seems counterproductive. I mean, if you're interested in military strategy, wouldn't you want a partner who appreciated that rather than someone who wanted you to pretend you weren't?" "You would think so," she said, then paused as if the concept was novel. "Are you human?" "Guilty as charged." David Chen, environmental systems engineer. He gestured to the atmospheric processor. "And you're clearly nobility, which means I should probably be addressing you with some kind of title and bowing appropriately." "Kira Thainvel," she said, then waved dismissively at his concern about protocol. "And please don't bow. I've had enough formal ceremony for one evening." "Fair enough." David settled onto a nearby maintenance crate, deciding that anyone who chose to have an existential crisis next to his atmospheric processors was probably in need of normal conversation rather than diplomatic protocol. So, intellectual companionship without argumentative tendencies. That's quite a contradiction in terms. Isn't it? Kira's ears perked up slightly. How can someone provide intellectual companionship without having opinions? And if you have opinions, how do you express them without occasionally disagreeing about something? "You can't," David said practically. "At least, not if you want actual companionship instead of just someone who nods agreeably at everything you say." Kira stared at him as if he'd just explained some fundamental principle of physics that she'd never encountered. "Human courtship doesn't work that way." "Human courtship is complete chaos," David replied cheerfully. "We generally start by spending time together doing things we both enjoy, see if we like each other's company, and eventually figure out if we want to build a life together. No formal ceremonies, no family negotiations, no predetermined compatibility assessments." "That sounds terrifying." "It is. Also considerably more effective than arranged marriages, at least if the goal is finding someone you actually want to live with." Kira considered this while David returned to his atmospheric calibrations. "What if you make the wrong choice? What if you choose someone who seems compatible but turns out to be unsuitable? Then you learn from the experience and make better choices next time," David said, adjusting pressure readings on his tablet. "The human approach to relationships involves a lot of trial and error. And your families don't object to this inefficient process?" David laughed. "My mother regularly objects to my dating choices, my career decisions, my living arrangements, and my dietary habits. But ultimately, she recognizes that I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of my decisions." "Your mother doesn't arrange courtship meetings with appropriate potential spouses?" "My mother occasionally tries to set me up with the daughters of her friends, but she'd never dream of arranging an actual marriage." "That would be..." David paused, searching for the right words. "That would be treating me like I'm not capable of making my own decisions about something as important as choosing a life partner." Kira was quiet for several minutes, watching David work on the atmospheric systems with the focus of someone genuinely interested in the technical process. "What you're doing," she said eventually, "it's quite complex, isn't it? The environmental balance for a multi-species diplomatic station." "Incredibly complex," David confirmed. "Humans need certain atmospheric compositions, but Vailians require different humidity levels, Altarians need higher oxygen concentrations, and crystalline species can't tolerate certain chemical compounds at all. Plus, everyone has different temperature preferences, and the air recycling has to account for different metabolic byproducts. How do you balance all those competing requirements?" David pulled up a holographic display showing the station's environmental zones and circulation patterns. Careful compartmentalization, adaptive circulation systems, and constant monitoring. Plus a lot of creative engineering when you encounter problems the original designers didn't anticipate. Kira leaned forward to study the display, her earlier dejection replaced by genuine curiosity. "The circulation patterns, they're based on fluid dynamics optimization, aren't they? You're treating the entire station like a single complex system rather than separate environmental zones." "Exactly," David said, impressed that she'd grasped the underlying principle so quickly. "Most people see it as just air conditioning on a large scale, but it's actually more like conducting an orchestra where every instrument needs different acoustic conditions. And when you have conflicting requirements, like if Altarians need high oxygen but crystalline species are sensitive to oxygen concentrations above certain levels, then you get creative," David said, highlighting several areas on the display. "Localized atmospheric gradients, transitional buffer zones, and emergency override protocols for when diplomatic meetings require species with incompatible environmental needs to occupy the same space." Kira studied the environmental schematic with the kind of intense focus that David associated with fellow engineers solving interesting problems. "The buffer zones, you could optimize them further if you used variable density transition fields instead of fixed gradients." David looked at the display again, following her logic. "That would actually work better for the diplomatic conference areas. More efficient energy usage and faster adaptation to changing occupancy requirements. And if you adjusted the circulation timing to account for metabolic rhythm variations," Kira continued, warming to the subject, "you could reduce overall atmospheric processing load by nearly 15%. Have you studied environmental systems engineering?" David asked, because her suggestions were not only technically sound but showed an intuitive understanding of system optimization that usually came from years of experience. "I've studied efficiency optimization in complex integrated systems," Kira replied. "Trade route logistics, resource allocation networks, multi-party diplomatic protocol management. The principles are similar regardless of the specific application." They spent the next hour discussing atmospheric engineering, with Kira offering insights that made David realize he'd been approaching several problems from unnecessarily complicated angles. Her suggestions weren't just theoretically sound, they were practical improvements that would make his job significantly easier. "You know," he said as they wrapped up their impromptu engineering consultation, "if you ever get tired of the diplomatic marriage circuit, environmental systems could use someone with your analytical skills." Kira laughed, though there was something wistful in the sound. "Unfortunately, noble Vailian women aren't typically encouraged to pursue technical careers. We're supposed to use our intellects for cultural patronage and social enhancement. That seems like a waste of talent." "It seems," Kira said, gathering her ceremonial robes in preparation to leave, "like many things about traditional Vailian society are wastes of various kinds." As she headed back toward the diplomatic levels, David found himself hoping she'd encounter more courtship disappointments in the future. Not because he wished her unhappiness, but because their conversation had been the most intellectually stimulating part of his week, and he wouldn't mind more impromptu engineering discussions with someone who saw complex systems optimization as an interesting puzzle rather than a boring technical necessity. 2 months of failed courtship meetings had established a routine. Kira would endure whatever variation of intellectual companionship without argumentative tendencies her family had arranged. The potential suitor would discover that she had actual opinions about subjects beyond domestic management, And she would end up in the environmental systems levels having increasingly sophisticated technical discussions with David Chen while her communication implant chimed with increasingly frantic messages from her mother. The microclimate controls for the botanical gardens are fascinating, Kira said, studying David's latest project on his diagnostic tablet. You're essentially creating dozens of different planetary environments within a single controlled space. Fascinating and incredibly complicated, David replied, adjusting humidity controls for the Zephyrian moss exhibits. Every species of plant requires different atmospheric conditions, soil compositions, and lighting spectrums. Plus, some of them are actively hostile to each other's environmental requirements. Like tonight's dinner companion and my interest in interstellar economics, Kira said dryly. Apparently, my understanding of trade deficit implications makes me inappropriately focused on masculine concerns. David paused in his calibrations. Wait, you understand interstellar economics? I have some theories about optimizing intersector trade flows that could improve efficiency by 30% while reducing transportation costs, Kira said with the casual tone of someone mentioning they'd had an interesting lunch. But according to tonight's potential spouse, such knowledge would make me a challenging wife rather than a supportive partner. Challenging how? Challenging in the sense that I might have opinions about decisions that affect our family's financial future, Kira explained, settling onto her usual maintenance crate. He wanted someone who would trust his business judgment without questioning or contributing to strategic planning. David set down his tablet and looked at her with the expression of someone trying to understand a particularly bizarre engineering problem. So he wanted a wife who was intelligent enough to be interesting but not intelligent enough to be useful. Precisely, Kira said, her ears drooping with familiar frustration. Though he phrased it as wanting someone who would complement his strengths without competing with his expertise. That's not a marriage, David said. That's hiring a decorative consultant. The distinction appears to be lost on most of my potential suitors, Kira replied, then brightened slightly as she noticed David's botanical environment display. Speaking of environmental optimization, have you considered using adaptive lighting cycles that mirror the seasonal variations of each plant's homeworld? You could significantly improve growth rates and reduce maintenance requirements. They fell into their usual pattern of technical discussion, with David explaining his engineering challenges and Kira offering analytical insights that consistently improved his system's efficiency. What had started as casual conversation had evolved into genuine collaboration, with Kira's optimization theories proving remarkably applicable to practical engineering problems. You know, David said as they worked on recalibrating the atmospheric processors, these conversations are the highlight of my week. It's nice to discuss complex problems with someone who sees them as interesting puzzles rather than tedious obligations. These conversations, Kira said quietly, are the only time I feel like myself rather than a political asset being evaluated for marriage potential. The comment hung between them with a weight that neither had quite intended. David continued his calibrations while processing the implications of what she'd said, while Kira studied the environmental control schematics with more attention than they strictly required. Kira, David said finally, can I ask you something that might be inappropriately personal? Given that I've been complaining about my romantic disasters for 2 months, I think we're past worrying about appropriate boundaries. What do you actually want in a marriage? Not what your family wants, not what the Vailian Council expects, but what would make you happy. Kira was quiet for several minutes, watching the atmospheric readout cycle through their diagnostic patterns. I want a partner who sees my intelligence as an asset rather than a liability, she said eventually. Someone who values my opinions even when they disagree with them. Someone who wants to build something together rather than just finding someone to manage the domestic aspects of their life. That doesn't sound unreasonable. It's apparently revolutionary by Vailian standards, Kira said with bitter humor. According to my mother's latest communication, I'm developing unrealistic expectations influenced by excessive exposure to alien cultural values. Alien cultural values like wanting to be treated as an equal. Exactly. Kira's communication implant chimed, and she glanced at it with visible reluctance. Speaking of unrealistic expectations, my family has arranged another courtship meeting for tomorrow evening. Commander Drakmore of the Vailian Strategic Command. Apparently, he specifically requested a wife with appropriate intellectual capabilities for strategic consultation. That sounds more promising than your usual suitors. It sounds like a trap, Kira corrected. Men who want strategic consultation from their wives usually want someone to agree with their decisions while providing the appearance of collaborative planning. David finished his diagnostics and stored his equipment, considering Kira's situation with the systematic approach he usually reserved for complex engineering problems. What happens if you keep refusing these arranged meetings? Eventually, the Vailian Council will arrange a marriage for me regardless of my preferences, Kira said matter-of-factly. The political alliance considerations outweigh my personal objections, and unmarried noble females are considered a diplomatic liability after a certain point. And if you refuse that arrangement? Exile from Vailian society. Loss of family connections, social status, and legal protections. Kira's ears drooped further. Not exactly appealing alternatives. What about marrying someone who isn't Vailian? Kira looked up at him with surprise. Interspecies marriage? It's legally possible, but socially complicated. Most species have cultural restrictions about marriage outside their own people. Humans don't, David said quietly. Human marriage law is based on mutual consent rather than species compatibility or political arrangements. You're suggesting? Kira stared at him as if he'd proposed something completely radical. I'm suggesting, David said carefully, that maybe the problem isn't that you're unsuitable for marriage. Maybe the problem is that you're looking in the wrong species. The following evening, Kira sat through the most excruciating courtship dinner of her career. Commander Drakmore was exactly what she'd expected, politically ambitious, strategically minded, and interested in a wife who would provide intellectual validation for decisions he'd already made rather than genuine collaborative partnership. Your reputation for analytical thinking is impressive, he said over the third course of what felt like an 18-course exercise in diplomatic torture. I believe you could provide valuable insights into domestic policy implementation. What about foreign policy? Kira asked, testing his boundaries. Or military strategy? Or economic planning? Those areas require specialized expertise and command authority that would be inappropriate for civilian consultation, Drakmore replied smoothly. But domestic policy impacts would certainly benefit from feminine perspective and cultural sensitivity. By the time dinner ended, Kira felt like she'd been slowly suffocated by polite condescension wrapped in strategic language. Drakmore's idea of intellectual partnership involved her providing cultural analysis and domestic insight while he made all significant decisions about their theoretical future together. Instead of returning to her family quarters to endure the inevitable post-courtship analysis, Kira found herself in the environmental systems levels again, where David was performing routine maintenance on the atmospheric processors. How did it go? He asked, though her expression probably answered his question. He wanted a strategic advisor who would never actually advise him on strategy, Kira said, settling onto her maintenance crate with the exhausted relief of someone finally reaching sanctuary. Intellectual partnership, as long as my intellect never challenged his authority or questioned his judgment. David continued his maintenance work while Kira processed her frustration. After several minutes of comfortable silence broken only by the hum of environmental systems, she looked at him with the expression of someone who just reached a decision that would change everything. David, she said, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised them both, will you marry me? David's diagnostic tablet slipped from his hands and clattered onto the floor. What? Will you marry me? Kira repeated, her ears straightening with determination. Not because you want to rescue me from an impossible situation, and not because of political alliances or family pressure. But because we work well together, we respect each other's intelligence, and we've built something over these months that feels more like partnership than anything I've experienced with my so-called appropriate suitors. David stared at her, his engineering mind clearly processing multiple variables and implications simultaneously. Kira, that's That's not how humans usually approach marriage. How do humans usually approach marriage? Well, typically there's dating. And falling in love. And romantic feelings. And David gestured helplessly. A lot more emotional build-up to the actual proposal. And how's that working out for most humans? Kira asked practically. What percentage of human marriages based on romantic feelings actually result in successful long-term partnerships? That's not really the point. Isn't it? Kira stood up and moved closer to him, her expression serious but not desperate. David, you're the only person I've met who treats me like an equal worth choosing rather than a problem to be solved. We have compatible goals, shared interests, and genuine mutual respect. We work well together. We enjoy each other's company. We're both looking for partnership rather than romance. Are we? David asked quietly. Aren't we? Kira countered. When you imagine your ideal marriage, what does it look like? David considered this with the careful thought he usually reserved for complex engineering challenges. Someone who understands what I do and finds it interesting. Someone I can talk to about problems and possibilities. Someone who sees building a life together as a collaborative project rather than parallel individual lives that happen to share space. And someone who makes you laugh, Kira added. Someone you trust. Someone who makes ordinary moments feel better just by being there. Yes, David said, then paused as he realized what she was suggesting. You think we could have that together? I think, Kira said with growing conviction, we already do.